left off last week, right? Because that's going to be important. And then we're going to move from there. All right, so who remembers this guy with the great haircut, right? Trivers. Is it terribly important that you remember all of this stuff from Trivers right now? Probably not. We will talk about Trivers and these specific theories later. Josh mentioned some of them in his sort of as an example, right? Not really as like, hey, you got to know about reciprocal altruism now, but like, here's an example of a theory. Here's an example of how we tested it. So that's what we want to think about from there. Josh, I'm going to sign you out if that's okay. All right. We do want to talk about some misunderstandings of evolution, right? How many of you, and I catch myself in this situation all the time, somebody says something and they're like, do you really believe that we came from monkeys? And I'm like, no, I don't, for two reasons. One, you don't use the word believe when you talk about science. And two, I mean, monkeys and us all came from the same thing. So whatever you want to call that thing, that's up to you, I suppose. Calling it what other folks have called is probably a good idea, so we don't get confused. So we should, though, think about a few misunderstandings about evolution. I think this will help us as we go forward. I'm going to assume most of you have not spent a lot of time thinking about evolution prior to the previous 2 weeks you were in this class, right? Is that true for most people? Most people. There are a couple caveats, I know, so we're going to let those people hang out there. I think these 3 points are really important, right? These 3 points are really sort of at the heart of a lot of people's rejection of evolution, right? I think a lot of people like to think about humans as something special and separate and unique, and we are, but in the same way that like a sea slug is separate and unique and special, right? It's exactly the same, right? I mean, we each went down 2 different paths. We each solved the same problems, but in different ways, right? And we each came to some point where we are now. That's not an end point by any means, right? If anybody's a Kurt Vonnegut fan, you know we're all going to eventually turn into dolphins. Nobody's a Kurt Vonnegut fan. Galapagos, right? I mean, we're headed there. Just hang in there for it, right? It's going to be exciting. So hopefully this class is easier to follow than a Kurt Vonnegut novel. Sometimes just barely, but we're right there. So first, because we're thinking about human behavior, right? We really want to think about how is evolution applied to behaviors, right? And we want to think about what are those things. One, evolution does not imply that human behavior is genetically determined, right? Because when we're thinking about evolution, we're thinking about genes, right? And wouldn't it be awesome if we had like a whole class on behavioral genetics? I mean, that'd be pretty exciting, right? I'd sign up for it. You should too, if it's ever offered. It's going to be special topics in a year. So, genetically, it's not genetically determined, right? The genes you have sort of set the table for things, right? And they can make you more or less likely to create certain proteins, which may make you more or less likely to do things, but that doesn't mean that it's determined, right? And that's where we want to. There are so many other factors. Josh talked about some of those factors, cultural factors, developmental factors, right? There are things, social factors that come into play that can affect behavior as well. The other thing is just because it's evolution doesn't mean that we're thinking about human behavior as something that's not able to be changed, right? And I think one of the great examples from the book is smiling, right? You ever smiled at somebody? Stop. It's a bad idea. It's a bad idea. So there's a great example I know you guys are like trying it now, but I'm serious. You should stop. Just making sure. So how many of you have read the book? I know Josh has. There's one, right? Did you read the book, example about smiling? So if you smile at someone, there seem to be some sex differences in what you think that smile might mean, right? There seem to be some different thresholds for judging someone else's interest in mating with you, right? And it seems like males have a slightly lower threshold than females, right? And that, I think, goes back to which sex is the choosier of the two, right? And so males are sort of like, oh, well, that person smiled, so they're definitely interested. And Yeah, so that's well, that might be something that has occurred, on some evolutionary level that helps in some way. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what we should follow, right? Just because somebody smiles doesn't mean that's what their intentions are. So we have to be aware of that. But by knowing that, right? By knowing that, we can actually work to change that behavior. Right? And I think the more we know about some of these evolutionary mechanisms, particularly evolutionary mechanisms related to short-term and long-term mating strategies, the better we can design educational and outreach efforts, right? And the more the more you know, right? That was a joke for 3 people in this room that are. I don't want to say it because I don't want to get to the point where I start saying of a certain age, right? Because then I feel like I've really crossed the threshold and I'm not ready for that, right? Because
Yeah. I get it.
I went to the eye doctor the other day and he called me a kid and I was really excited. I wasn't old enough to participate in a study. He's doing a study on I don't know. I didn't have time to ask him because I had things I had to do, and I might go back and ask him like some drops that are going to help with like age-related issues with your lens somehow. I don't know. I was kind of excited, but he's like, "Oh, you got to be 45." And I'm like, "I got time." It's like I can't be in that study yet. So human behavior, it's not fixed, right? It's not stuck. And the more we know about it, the more we know about these evolutionary sort of forces and influences on our behavior, the better we can guide what we do going forward, right? Just because you have an evolutionary inclination, does that seem like something I can use? Doesn't mean you should act on that inclination. Doesn't mean that's a socially or ethically or morally acceptable inclination. It means that inclination was beneficial at some point, on average, going back in the history of our species, right? Okay. How many of you have ever wanted to, push someone off a cliff? Anybody want to? Yeah, right? Not that specific. Oh, well, Paul, you're welcome to share up to the legal threshold. Right. Don't want to. I should tell you, I'm not a mandatory reporter, though there may be some in this room. Right? Are there a couple? Yeah, I think there are. Right? There are a couple mandatory reporters in here, so be careful with that. So, but having that urge to push someone off a cliff, right? Not something you should do most of the time. I'm going to say there are sometimes you probably should, right? And there are certain situations I will let you create in your own head, because I'm not going to tell you where that line is, where pushing someone off of a cliff is acceptable. But there were times when that was acceptable in our evolutionary history, right? And so you think about self-defense, right, Chandler? And so in that case, we even have laws that in self-defense allow you to do certain things we wouldn't in other situations, right? There might be some threshold to prove it was self-defense, right? You can't just go around kicking old ladies because you want to, right? There's some threshold there. So just because it is some urge that was helpful to us at some point doesn't mean we should follow that all the time now, but knowing about those urges, knowing the background behind that can really help us better design efforts to change that behavior if it's a behavior we've decided is not acceptable, right? And I think that's important. The other thing is, and I sort of hate this phrasing in one sense, but in the other sense I'm not quite sure there's better phrasing. And what we're saying is that evolution does not imply optimal design. And the use of the word optimal here gives me a small problem because when I think of something as being optimal, I don't necessarily think of it being like maximized. It's just for the conditions that you have, right? And so that's why I wouldn't use optimal. The author of the book used optimal. I'll leave it there for you in case you hear it, right? The point is, evolutionary mechanisms are not not at their maximum, right? Okay, there are costs to everything that you do, right? And so what you're constantly trying to do with these evolutionary mechanisms over the course of the history of a species is think about what can we do given the resources we have to get the best outcome possible, right? And so I think about your performance in your classes, right? You are not going to be maximizing your efforts in this class. I understand that, right? How many of you are taking another class besides this class? How many of you have occupational responsibilities? You work a job. How many of you have other extracurricular obligations? You're in some service group. How many of you have family obligations, right? So all of those things are taking up part of your time, right? Okay? And because they're taking up part of your time, what are you doing? You're doling out resources as best as possible so you can get the best response given the cost, given the resources that you have, right? Evolution works that way, right? We might think, wow, amazing brains. Have we talked about hips and birth canals in this class? I don't think not yet. We should, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we should. Yeah.
You do in every class.
Yeah. Well, and there's one other thing that so there's one major, there's some complaints I have with your book. One is that there's not a larger section on Garcia's rats, which is, anybody who's taken one of my classes before, I probably talked about Garcia's rats longer than you thought I should. Jerry Garcia was a huge rat collector, and I just think, also, there's an age threshold for that,
Yeah.
right? How many of you know who Jerry Garcia is? Like 4. Great. A few years ago, I saw this kid at the mall. I lived not in this state. I lived in North Carolina at the time. And I only go to the mall like once every, I don't know, like decade, if I can help it, right? I try to. And the kid had on a Kurt Cobain shirt. And I thought, that kid thinks that's like classic rock. And I just felt so sad, and I just went home and ate ice cream. I was like, I'm done for the day. So it was like a 12-year-old wearing a Kurt Cobain shirt, you know? It'd be like, you know, me walking around with, I don't know, like, yeah, Led Zeppelin, right? I mean, I have nothing against Led Zeppelin at all, in fact. All right, optimal design. Let's talk about brains, because I think this is a great, how many of you have a brain? It's about how many hands I thought would go up. How many of you are aware of birth canals? This is not a ride at Camden Park. I'm not going to ask. I was going to ask if any of you were conceived or born at Camden Park. I imagine it could happen. Go on the Thunderbolt Express and see what happens. So, true story. My great-grandmother rode the Big Dipper. Yeah, like 5 generations of my family have been on that roller coaster. I live to tell about it.
That's impressive.
I don't think we're going for a 6th. Because that's why we're stopping at 5. All right, so brains, birth canals. Birth canals are directly related to hips, right? So we should think about this balance between costs and benefits, right? We can think about it with brains. And how many of you think having a bigger brain is awesome? Yeah, that's pretty true, right? So the reason our species has been, you know, one of the reasons we've been so great at like killing all the other species on the planet, because we're really awesome at that, is because we have really big brains, right? That's how we've solved some of the evolutionary problems that have faced us, is bigger brains, right? There are other possible solutions to solve those problems. How many of you have ever seen a lion? They went with bigger teeth, right? We did not go with bigger teeth. We got these little chiclet teeth, right? They're useless in terms of like attack or defense, right? What about your, what about those claws that you have? Yeah, no, they're useless too, right? Like fingernails, they're not really good for much other than like scratching off a tick or a flea, right? And they don't really do much for you, okay? So we're not using any kind of attack there. What about that long tail that you can whip people with like an alligator? No, we don't have one of those either, do we? Right, so we don't have any of those things, right? But other species have them, and they've used them to solve some of the same problems we have. But we went with big brains. It's a totally random thing. We had no choice in that. It just happened one day. Out came something with a slightly bigger brain and a little bit of fur on it, and it happened to not die, so it made more of itself, right? I know. It really puts a lot of interest in your family history, right? So we want bigger brains, and over the course of our species, we've sort of had bigger brains over time, right? But the balance here is we have to stay walking, right? And so probably the greatest change in our species, right, that led to us. That one moment, if you want to go back in evolutionary history, and in fact, there are some folks, Robert Leakey being one of those, who says that this moment is the moment of humans. And anything after this moment, no matter the species, the genus, should be considered a human for his purposes, right? And for those of you that don't know Robert Leakey, he comes from like a long line of people who have found really interesting things in the dirt in Africa, right? And his mother and his father were both great paleontologists, right? And so they found like these skulls and described things like ancient human remains, right? And Robert Leakey did as well. But the thing that he said is probably one of the most important events in our history as a species is bipedal locomotion. And for Leakey's purposes, anything after the point in the history of our species where we're on two legs, anything from that point on is a human. He describes it as a human. He calls it a human, and that's kind of the end of the story. And while you might want to argue the fine points of that, he makes a really strong argument. He makes a really important point that walking upright was great for our species, right? It allowed us to do a few things. Allowed us to see really far. Did we talk about this? We talked about bipedal locomotion a little bit, right? No? Nobody remembers. It allowed us to see farther, right? Gave us better perspective. We got our heads up above the grasses, right, on the savanna in Africa, which was great. It gave us some other advantages. How many of you have ever been on the savanna in Africa? It's hot. It's sunny. There aren't a whole lot of trees. You have some trees, right? So by going upright, we were able to reduce the amount of our body that's exposed to the sun at any given point so we don't overheat, right? And so there's some other things we did too. We started shaving genetically, right? We started having less hair as a species, but we started walking upright, and that was great. It gave us more locomotion, right? We were much more efficient at moving. If you start to think about like what are the best running species in the world, do you know where humans rank on that list? Almost at the top, right? Almost at the top. Now, some of you are going to say, like, what about those cheetahs? You only have to outrun a cheetah for 3 seconds. Because if it doesn't catch you and eat you in 3 seconds, it's out of energy. That's it, right? True story. You really only have to outrun a cheetah for a few seconds and they have to stop. You're like, haha, I'm still running. How many of you run marathons? How many of you know an idiot who runs a marathon? Yeah, there you go, right? How long is a marathon? 26.2 miles, right? Marathons are long. There's actually, I should tell you about this guy, Bernd Heinrich. Chris, you're going to really enjoy this story. There's this guy, Bernd Heinrich. He actually, for a while, I think he still might, he had the record for the longest distance a human has ever run in 24 hours. He ran like 136 miles in a 24-hour. I know, right? Like continuously.
There's a guy in my hometown that does that, like around our like city park, and he does it to like he just does it for fun. Like he'll like post that, oh, I'm gonna run 120 miles in the next like 48 hours. Like let's go, like, and he'll just go like for hours, just nonstop.
That's impressive, isn't it?
It's insane.
Yeah, that too. But other species aren't really doing that, right? Even those species you're thinking about that are really good runners, they're not. I mean, humans are really up there at the top of the list when it comes to runners. That bipedal locomotion did that for us. Have you ever seen the hips of a gorilla? They've got nice wide hips, right? Have you ever seen a gorilla give birth? No, and you never will. It happens so fast you'll never know it. They're walking along, chewing on some grass, kapow. There's a big slimy glob of gorilla on the ground. They pick it up, wipe it off, and they keep going about their business. That's gorilla birth. And the entire history of humans keeping gorillas captive, which, say what you want about that, there has been one time in that entire length of time, and we've been keeping gorillas and other primates captive for, let's say, 200 years, I think is a good estimate. In that entire time, we've got sort of like one documented example of a difficult gorilla birth. And just a few years ago, they had to. It was so unheard of. They had to call in a human obstetrician to perform a C-section on a gorilla. I know, it's right. You would think, like, shouldn't there be a gorilla vet that does this? They don't need them. They don't need them because they fall out, right? I assume. That's how that feels, right? It's just like you're walking along, you're like, what's that slimy thing behind me? Oh, been waiting a few months for that. Finally it arrived. Gorillas have wider hips and they have smaller brains, right? There you go. Humans, we have narrower hips, we have bigger brains, okay? How many of you have heard of complications during childbirth for humans? Like everybody, right? How many, well, you don't have to answer this, but how many of you didn't go out through the normal exit ramp? Yeah, how many, right? How many of you were C-section babies, right? How many of you know someone who had a C-section? I mean, that's very, very common, right? And the reason for that, narrow hips and big brains. Although I think if you were, I always ask, like, you should call your mom when you leave class and say, hey, Mom, would you have liked for me to have a bigger brain when I was born? And invariably, your mothers will tell you no. Your brain was big enough. Maybe if it was a little smaller, it would have been fine. Because it's a very difficult thing, right? But we're here constantly kind of keeping this balance, right? And right now we're at that balance point where if we have bigger brains, then we need a bigger exit ramp, right? We need the hips to be wider so that the birth canal is larger, right? But if the hips get wider, right, your hometown hero is not running 120 miles in 2 days, right? That locomotion efficiency is reduced, okay? As hips get wider, locomotion efficiency goes down. As a species. So we're at that balance point, right? So we think about things being optimal, right? Are we maximizing brain size? No, we can't, right? Now we found a trick around that. How many of you have ever seen a horse born? Yeah, what's a horse do as soon as it's born? Gets up and it runs a race, right? They're up quickly, right? They're up within a couple minutes. Have you ever seen a baby, like a human baby born? What are they doing in a couple minutes?
Nothing.
Paul, that was brilliant. Can you do that one more time? Everybody watch Paul. That's what a human baby does for probably the first couple decades, right? How many of you have done that recently when you went to visit your families? Yeah, right? I know, okay? So it happens, right? So we're born with something, it's called neoteny, right? Is the process. Basically, you're born with an undercooked brain. Okay, that allows you to develop a bigger brain later without having the wider hips, right? That would reduce locomotion efficiency. Okay, and so we're kind of at that point where if our brains were born any less developed, we wouldn't survive. If hips were any bigger, we would lose that efficiency of movement. We want bigger brains, so we're kind of trying to work around those constraints to get the best outcome possible given the costs, right? And I think that's an important concept to think about with anything, right? How many of you like movies? Yeah. So you know what the frame rate is for a standard film? It's like 26 frames per second, right? Do you know why it's 26 frames per second? That is the slowest, that is the lowest frame rate. Okay, and what we mean by frame rate is how many pictures per second, right? How many little individual pictures are we showing per second? And so the lower the frame rate, the cheaper the film, right? Because you take fewer pictures, you have less material. 26 frames per second is the lowest frame rate possible without you watching the image and it looks like it flickers. Anything faster than that's a waste, right? Anything faster than 26 frames per second, you could double it. And as long as it's standard film, not 3D, that's a whole separate story. As long as it's standard, you're not going to notice the difference, right? You're not going to see the difference in that. It's a total waste of money, right? And so Hollywood producers realized this early. I can cut it down to 26 frames per second and it's not flickering, right? That's the best cost versus benefit sort of analysis that we're doing there, right? And we've done that as a species over time. What's the best cost and benefit we can get from hips and brains, right? How can we get all of those to the best possible combination of outcomes? Does that make sense? Questions about that? Okay. Here's a whole big list of stuff. 2 whole slides of awesome things that have happened in the history of our species, right? Do I think it's important for you to memorize these specific dates? No. There are a couple reasons why. We are continuously, thankfully, getting new information, getting new data, finding new evidence, right? That sometimes shifts these dates a little bit, right? The basic framework, I think, is there. And I don't think we're going to find evidence that says, oh, the first vertebrates arrived after apes. Okay, so you know, some things have to happen before others, right? These dates are pretty solid, right? Now there's going to be some nuances as we pick up new data and go. Now once we get down here, right, here's apes, here's primates, so these are kind of important landmarks. You get your mammals here, okay? Then we start to get, this is a big one right here, that bipedal locomotion, right? You guys know Artie? That's what they call him, right? Kind of a nickname. We give all these things nicknames because they have really long, complicated names. I think it's also great to give them names like Artie and Lucy because I think that humanizes them a bit, and so you can more easily think about them as being one of your ancestors. Anybody have an ancestor named Lucy? No? I mean, it's possible, right, Miriam? I mean, somebody in your family could be named Lucy. I don't know, right? Whatever. And what about Artie? You start calling people that, right? So I think that's kind of a good mechanism. I wish we did that a little bit better. Then you've got a bunch of other stuff. Now, here is sort of, I think once you get down in this section, that's where things start to change more. And why does it start to change more? Because for our purposes, we think a lot of stuff happened there, right? We think a lot of things happened during that time frame. We're trying to track humans as they're moving from one location to another. We're finding new evidence. It's harder to find fossilized records as you go back farther, right? So how many of you can find a paper that you wrote last year? Yeah, right, Tiffany? Can you find a paper you wrote in the 3rd grade? It's gone, right? It's the farther you go back, the harder it is to recover this information, right? And so the stuff that's been more recent, we're finding more evidence for that, right? More evidence to fill in some of these gaps and adjust things and shift dates back and forth. In no way does that indicate that any of this is wrong, right? Or that the basic plan is wrong or the basic ideas are wrong. It simply means we found more information. We need to fit that into our hypothesis, right? I think that's the great thing about a good hypothesis is it's testable. When you get data, whatever that data is, you can do something with it, right? You can go, well, that aligned with my hypothesis. Great. Let's see what other information we can get. Or it doesn't align, and then you just have to adjust your hypothesis, right? And if you've got a good hypothesis, it can take those adjustments, right? And evolutionary theory and the hypotheses, most of the hypotheses that come out, people come up with bad ones all the time. But evolutionary theory itself has really stood the test of time, right? Every opportunity that we've had to test it has come back with a, yeah, evolution's right. Have there been nuances? Certainly, we talked about some of the things that we've developed since Darwin sort of first formulated these ideas and other folks before Darwin. But in no case have we said, you know what, that Darwin guy didn't know what he was talking about. He was totally wrong. All right. I guess we should talk about the out of Africa theory for a little bit, right? Because I think that's kind of an important thing. Just to kind of give people, right? Because this is an example of, and I think, Josh, I'm just thinking about how deep I want to go with this. Because this out of Africa theory really has so many levels, right? There's so many things we could talk about here. And maybe we should just hit them all. Let's just do it. You guys ever heard of a thing called racism? Don't know if that's out there, right? Is that still a thing? Because it was the last time I checked. And unfortunately, there has been a ton of racism that has influenced some evolutionary work over the years, and some folks have used evolutionary ideas to support their racist ideas as well, right? It's kind of gone both ways. There's actually a guy in the history department that's getting ready to work on it. He's working on an interesting book about a newspaper publisher in the late 1800s who was a big proponent of evolutionary theory, but using that to support his racist ideas, right? And I think that goes to show you, like, evolution doesn't have its own bias, right? It just is what it is, right? You collect the data, here it is. How people use that data is sort of a thing, right? Like I think like nuclear power is another great example of that. Great science, right? It's awesome. It's just science. But there are people who use that for destructive purposes. There are people who use that for constructive purposes, right? So you can kind of take that both ways, and I think that's unfortunately folks go the wrong way sometimes. So people have always kind of thought like, hey, where did humans come from, right? And I'm just going to cut to the chase, sub-Saharan Africa. Right there you go. Circle it on your map. It's a done story, right? However, there are folks who continuously try to move the evolution of the human species out of Africa sooner and into some European locations, because the sooner we get that out of Africa and into Europe, the greater white people are, right? And I'll just go ahead and say it. I mean, that's the thinking behind this, right? There's no real sense in not putting it out there. The problem with that is it's not always supported by science, right? What's cool is when you do find some evidence, you're like, well, here's an interesting sort of new wrinkle in the movement of our species across the planet, right? And that's really awesome. But there's no reason you should try to push that one place or the other, right? It is what it is. So the out of Africa theory is pretty straightforward. Basically, there was a migration out of Africa into different locations, right? Asia, Europe, so forth. There were some different species there. Later, there were what we would consider modern humans, came out of Africa and sort of took over those places from those other hominid species, right? I think one of the things that's hard for us to think about, because how many of you have ever lived in a time when there was more than one hominid on the planet? Like nobody, right? Okay. But there was a time when there were, as far as we can tell, multiple humans, right? Different species of humans at one time. And I think that's very hard for us to get our heads around, right? And I think that's an important thing to think about. The other approach to this sort of the counter theory to out of Africa theory is the what do they call it, the multi-regional hypothesis, right? So basically their idea is there were like 3 different species of humans, and sort of they each evolved on their own into the same species that we are now. And I'm going to tell you, it was pretty amazing we've all evolved into our species once, right? Because that's kind of a, statistically speaking, it's an extremely rare thing that could, because there's so many other things we could have evolved into at any, right? I mean, other paths we could have taken at any given time, right, Paul? And to have done that like 3 times in 3 different locations, it just increases the likelihood that didn't happen, right? And so that multi-regional hypothesis, while there is a sliver of evidence that might say there's some bit of truth there, most of it just aligns very well with this out of Africa theory. There are some gaps still need to be filled in as we go, and folks are doing that, which is really pretty awesome. Now there is some interbreeding between these. How many of you always, I don't know, maybe Google just knows what I like to read, but I'm constantly getting these articles like, now people say Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were interbreeding at, whatever 1,000 years ago, and then, oh no, we've moved it 5,000 years. And those are interesting on some level. The amount of interbreeding between one human species and another is pretty minimal, right? I think most people, if you have like a lot of Neanderthal DNA, you're talking about like 2%, right? That's like a lot. And considering, and that's not much, right? Does that make sense? Okay. There's like a ton of genetic evidence we could go into for this, but we don't necessarily have to do that. All right. Other questions about that before we move on to something else? Anything else I need to point out? I'll make sure I don't miss anything. Right? Okay. So we've talked about sort of the biological approaches. We haven't really talked much about psychological approaches that have influenced evolutionary psychology, right? And I feel like, how many of you are psych majors? How many of you are not psych majors? And Chris, what was your major again? Nursing. Yeah, I noticed that. So I remember I looked through everybody's like list, and I was like, why are people taking these weird classes? Yeah, art and psych, right? Nursing. Why are you here? You just needed hours? Thought it sounded great. Oh.
I've run out of options for other psychology classes at this point.
Wow. You a psych minor?
No, but good.
Might as well. I mean, it's something. So I think I can give a little bit of short stick to psychological theories, right? I think I have to spend as much time on that because I think you know some of it, right? Like I don't. So we're going to talk about Freud because I mean you have to, whether you say like he was an idiot or he was awesome. You have to talk about him. But how many of you have had a class where you talked about Freud before? Yeah. How many of you had like 2 classes where somebody said something about Freud, right? Okay. Anybody in the 3 or more category? It happens, right? So I assume you have some idea about Freud. How many of you remember Hamilton? Anybody had a class talked about Hamilton? I mean, like a couple of you, right? But most of you haven't, so we spent more time there. What was interesting about Freud is he sort of had these what they call is like life instincts, and he also had like sex instincts, right? And early in his sort of thinking, he had these 2 sort of categories of thought. And what was really interesting, I don't know, I remember this guy named Charles Darwin, who had an idea about like natural selection and sexual selection. It seemed like he had sort of 2 different categories of thinking about things too. And Freud early on sort of mimicked that process. A little bit later, I don't know what happened to Freud, maybe the cocaine. He got away from, you have to have a little character assassination once in a while, right? He got away from that sort of Darwinian approach to behavior, and I think he might have been better served. I think we'd still be talking about him just as much had he stayed with Darwinian thought, but we would be talking about him in a much more positive light than we do now. Then like, hey, look at this idiot. He had us really going in the wrong direction really hard for a long time, and then we kind of turned around and realized something else was happening. I think had he stuck with that thinking, there would have been a period of time where we would have like really forgotten him and tried to like push him off, but then he would have come back around, and I think that would have been awesome for him. So that's something about Freud. A little bit later, some folks came up with an idea, and they were like, it's not instincts. You know, I don't know what, anybody know William James? You gotta know something about William James too, right? He was like, I don't know, he had some title like the father of psychology, so I feel like he was sort of important, right? And he had, I don't know if you've ever read anything by William James. He had, he wrote his book, in case you want to know the title of that, it was Psychology, right? So it was pretty straightforward. But he had a chapter on instincts, and that chapter on instincts was just incredible. I mean, the list of instincts that he created for humans, right? And he said, oh, well, human behavior, we have more instincts because we have more behavioral flexibility, right? Oh, that's really awesome. And he came up with all these, like collecting was an instinct. How many of you collect something? Everybody collects something, right? I don't want to know what it is. I really don't. Because I still want to be able to like look in your face when I see you walking around campus and in the building. I do not want to know what you collect, okay? Collections, right? It's kind of a thing. So he had all this list of instincts. And Freud kind of had an idea about instincts as well. A bit later, there were some other guys who said, no. Humans only have like 2 instincts. 3 instincts maybe. We don't have a lot of instincts. What's really, really important is our ability to learn. That's all we've really got, right? We just have this ability to learn, and then we just learn a bunch of stuff, and that's how it goes. And there were these guys like Watson. You guys remember Watson? Always trust someone who goes around scaring little kids, right? Isn't that just really instill confidence in you, right? And that guy, like he's going to make little kids afraid of white rabbits. That seems like a guy we should trust, right? Of course, if you're choosing between him and, cocaine Siggy, I don't know, right? I mean, it's kind of a tough cocaine Siggy. It's kind of a tough choice, right? I mean, what do you do? I'm going to put that on a hat. Yeah. Oh, man. There's so many things I want to say right now, I'm not going to. So much. So Watson had this idea, and he was like, hey, it's all like learning stuff, right? And then there was a guy that came around like after Watson, and he had a cool name too. You guys heard of that guy Skinner? Yeah. He was named after the Skinner box. Oh, no, wait, it went the other way. The Skinner box was named after him, right? There was also a guy there that's important. We should always write his name down. Pavlov, right? Pavlov wasn't initially really thinking about behavior, right? He was was really studying dog salivary glands. I always like to point this out to people, right? And I always think like, how did he like call his mom up and go like, hey mom, changing my major to dog spit? I just don't know. Like the next time your parents give you a hard time about your chosen field of study, just tell them, you know, I could be studying dog slobber, but I'm not. I chose something that's a little bit more employable, except Pavlov is like probably, I don't know, if you want to make a list like top 10 most important people in the history of psychology, Pavlov's probably up there somewhere on that top 10 list, right? Anyway, so there you go. You got these different kinds of conditioning. You guys know classical operant conditioning, right? So these behaviorists, they said, oh man, it's got to be behavior. It's got to be behavior. You just learn stuff. Maybe there's a couple instincts, like you're afraid of falling. I don't know, right? And maybe that's it. And then everything else is just learned behavior. And then there was a guy, John Garcia. This is when we're going to talk about Garcia's rats. And I would actually rather talk about John Garcia than Harry Harlow. Because Harlow gets overplayed. Garcia doesn't get credit. If you want to learn about Harlow, there's a picture of a monkey. But instead, let's talk about Garcia and rats. And I got to cut off part of the head because rats don't have as complicated brains as monkeys. And then let's just put like a big snout and whiskers. There you go. So Garcia and his rats. So Garcia had this idea. He was like, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make rats vomit. That Pavlov guy and his dog spit, that's nothing compared to rat vomit, right? And so what he decided to do was to give rats some water. That seems reasonable. He's like a nice guy, right? And then later he would make those rats sick, right? He would make them sick to their stomachs, right? So that's exciting. So he had sort of like two conditions that also had two conditions. So it's a slightly complicated story. We just want to kind of go through it a little bit. He would give rats water. And while these rats were drinking water, he would do something, right? The water either had a flavor to it or he would flash lights at them. Okay, one of the two. And so while the rats were drinking the water and they got this tasty water, well, that seems awesome, he would do a couple things. Tasty water, and he would shock them. Sounds exciting, right, Paul? Seems like something you'd be into. So he's going to shock these rats while they're drinking this tasty water. He would also, while another group of rats were drinking tasty water, later he would have something in that water that would make them sick later, right? So you had two groups of tasty water. You had the flashy light, or the shock, tasty water shock, and you had tasty water sick, okay? He had another group, rats would drink water, no flavor, and he would flash lights at them. Okay, he's flashing lights. Still had those same two outcomes, right? You could get the flashy lights and you get electrocuted. Or you get the flashy lights and you get sick later, okay? So you have those two same conditions. What's interesting about this is the rats were not able to figure out that the flashy water was making them sick, just as they were not able to figure out that the tasty water was electrocuting them. Okay? And the reason for that is, if you think about this for a moment, imagine you're a rat. I'm going to give you a few moments to get centered on that, right? So you're a rat. What are the things that hurt you if you're a rat? It's like a cat, right? And what do? You see a cat. Right? So if you see something, it can inflict pain, right? So you see these bright flashy lights and you get electrocuted. That makes sense. That's a connection you could make. If you eat something and it has a funky flavor to it, or has a flavor to it, and you get sick later, right? Ingesting things makes you sick, right? And so that weird flavor you had, even if you thought it was a good flavor, later on you might think that's a bad flavor. How many of you have eaten something and you thought, man, that's the best thing I ever had, and you've never been back to eat there again because it made you sick a day later, right? It happens. Okay, happens all the time. Okay, I'm sure everybody has a list of restaurants where they won't eat anymore, right? Okay, and that's because of that. And the rats kind of have the same mechanism, right? So they were able to figure out a visual stimulus goes with physical pain, an olfactory stimulus goes with nausea. That makes sense. Now, some folks will tell you, oh, that means we come in pre-programmed, right? They'll use this word prepared learning, right? I like to use a different phrase called ecological learning. And this sort of, I think, takes a bit of what those pure instinct guys were saying and those pure behavior guys were saying and puts that together in a little more complicated and nuanced story, right? How many of you have ever tried to exist? Yeah, Tiffany, it's a pretty complicated thing, right? So maybe there's more than one process. Maybe there's more than one mechanism, right, going on. Does that mean humans, if you're all instinct, if you say all instinct, does that mean humans can't learn? Well, obviously we can learn. But we also have instincts as well. There's certain things we can't learn, right? And that's what ecological learning says. There are things that are easier for us to learn because over the course of the history of our species, those things made some sense to us, right? Those were things that, again, an olfactory stimulus and nausea, those things go together, right? Okay? I was getting ready to ask, who's ever seen something that made them nauseous, but that's a bad example. Because you can see things that make you nauseous. That's different. But how many of you have ever eaten something and then it electrocuted you? That doesn't work, right? It doesn't happen. You don't eat something and then feel physical pain typically, right? I mean, that's not a... If you're eating something, if you're eating like a handful of nails, that might be different. But does that make sense? So we want to think about that ecological learning, okay? Questions about that? See, that's so much better than monkeys, right? All Harlow did was like grab some monkeys and make one out of wire and make one out of terry cloth and go like, hey monkeys, who do you like? We'll only give you food out of this one that looks weird, and you can go snuggle up with the other one when you get mad or upset, right? Whatever. That's Harlow. That was easy, right? Then there was some idea about the cognitive revolution, right? Anybody heard about the cognitive revolution? I'm hard on cognitive folks all the time. I don't mean to be, it just happens. My problem with cognitive folks, I mean, there's good and bad here, right? So the good thing is, like, we can start thinking about things going on in your head. That's pretty cool. Information processing, brilliant, right, to focus on that. The problem is, there are a couple problems. One of those is what we call domain generality, right? Most cognitive folks were thinking like you've got some very basic 2 or 3 mechanisms, right? And those are the things that you use to apply to every little thing that you do, right? They're not implying that you have all of these little instincts, right? And I think this comes from this idea that humans are awesome, right? I don't know if any of you folks have ever thought that. And because humans are awesome, we must have different mechanisms from everything else, right? We've got some advanced way that our brains work. Our brains work exactly like every other brain, okay? If you pull the brain out of a dog, it works the same as our brain, okay? Doesn't mean our brains are solving problems in the same exact way. We've got a different set of tools we can use to solve those problems, right? But the brain mechanisms are the same. Even Steven Pinker. There's a great quote from Steven Pinker, and when he said, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, he said, once you realize your dog has a cortex and an amygdala and all of these other brain structures, it really changes your perspective on life. It really changes your perspective on the way that you look at other species, and I think you look at our own species. So, and Pinker he's in that cognitive group, right? I mean, he's over there. So we want to avoid that domain generality. At the same time, we don't necessarily think every single thing that we do is an instinct, right? So you got to find somewhere in between. Where is that in between? I think we're still working that out, right? Which is really awesome. The other problem I have with most cognitive folks is they do this, right? Stuff happens here, right? And they're like, well, stuff comes in and stuff comes out. Well, how many of you have big boxes in your head? No one, right? And so I think on some level that's not useful, right? On some level it is useful, right? I think it's okay. It's like we need to think about the different mechanisms you have, but that's like looking at your car and saying, hey, it's got a go mechanism. There's some mechanism in my car that makes it go, right? Mary, does that help you? Are you going to be a mechanic with, well, I know there's something in here that makes it go, and just draw a box around that? If you go to your mechanic and he's got a diagram like this, like, oh, it's got a go part, and then it's got a stop part, don't trust that guy, right? Not at all. Because if that's the book he's studying to figure out how your car works, that's not helpful. He's got to tell me what's in that go box, right? And some cognitive folks aren't so great about telling me what's in that go box. And I don't mean more boxes. You know, there's like a go fast box and a go slow box, right? I don't want that. I want to, here's the squishy part, right, for your brain. Like, here's the squishy part. Like, here's the amygdala, right? So we've got a part called the amygdala, and it does something very specific, right? And that's what I want to know. Cognitive folks aren't the best at that all the time. So there you go. So there we go. Again, that privileged class of information, what they mean by that is those sort of, going back to that idea about Garcia, right? Because this is a guy that I feel like was kind of in the middle. Like he was closer to the line than I think a lot of folks have been, either before or since, right? Trying to find what is, not is it instincts or is it learning, but what is the combination of those two things, right? And that can vary depending on what we're trying to do, right? Depending on the situation. I think people who buy into one sort of theoretical orientation over another, I don't like that approach myself. Give me the data. Let me interpret that data and let me see what works, right? I'm perfectly fine with different things working at different times, right? Remember those big brains. If you don't think you have a big brain, call your mom. She'll tell you it was plenty big enough, right? She'll tell you had a big brain when you were born, so let's use that big brain. All right. Took a bit longer than I thought it would. All right. Don't worry about min and singles bars. I mean, it was an example. You didn't need it. It was an example of how you might test an evolutionary psychology theory. We've got other examples we'll talk about in a moment. Here's a nice definition of adaptations. Josh did a great job talking to you about adaptations. There's some key components there. Reliably develop, right? Helps you either solve a problem of survival or reproduction. Okay. We have those byproducts. Okay. Don't necessarily they don't solve a problem, but they just kind of get bounced along. Okay. Get carried along. And noise. There are some things that just happen randomly, right? Okay. I think, Josh, you did a great job talking about that belly button example, right? They use that in the book as well. Umbilical cords, definitely an adaptation, right? That's your nutrient pipeline from your mother until you fall out of her uterus, right? Belly buttons, byproduct. You got to have an inspout for that umbilical cord, right? That's the belly button. Shape of the belly button. How many of you have a belly button shaped like this? I don't know. What about that? There you go. Let's imagine those are different belly button shapes, right? I don't spend a lot of time looking at belly buttons, apparently. Does it matter what the shape of it is? No. I mean, that's just some random thing that happened and it doesn't really matter. All right. There's some babies. You should always glue babies' heads together like this. This is great adhesive right there. I don't know. I mean, what are these kids look so happy. You think that's Photoshopped? You can't get 3 babies happy like that. I don't know. All right, so for adaptations, definitely want to be efficient. If it's not efficient, what happens? You die, right? Because you only have limited resources, right? Okay. Again, reliable. Let's skip over that. We talked about that environment of evolutionary adaptedness. I do want to give a word of caution here, right? I think phenomenal concept, phenomenal idea. The problem is, are you ever going to know everything about that environment of evolutionary adaptedness? No. And we're working backwards, right? We're working backwards on that, Mary, because we have the adaptations now, and we're making some assumptions about what that environment was based on a lot of great sources of data, but it's still, we're not there taking a look at that, right? And in one sense we can't, because it's not a specific location, which is also important to think about. This is a location over the course of time, right? So this environment is not just, oh, I'm hanging out in sub-Saharan Africa. This is over the course of some period of time, and we have to think about that that as well. And so I just want you to be cautious when you go out there and you look at these like some theories that are developed, right? And when you develop your own theory, be careful what assumptions you make about that EEA, right? Make sure you know what it is, and make sure that there's not an alternative explanation that could come from that, because that's something to consider as well. All right, I think Josh did a great job talking about these levels of evolutionary analysis. For the purposes of your project, this one's true. You're not going to worry about that. We're not going to mess with that level. You should probably pick something out in this middle level, right? And Josh gave you some great examples. Parent-offspring conflict, kin altruism, right? There are these kind of big chunks, okay? And then what we're going to want you to do is, once you've selected one of those, come down and develop some specific hypothesis and how we might go about testing that. And again, we're going to try to use publicly available data, right? Here's the same chart. This is from your book for the 4 of you that have purchased that. The rest of you can see it here on the slides. How many of you have purchased the book? Oh, wow, that's impressive. How many of you have taken off the cellophane? How many of you knew it came with cellophane?
Mine online, so
They have an ebook of it? Was it now, did you get the new edition or the older one? I know, right. I need one of those because I'm tired of carrying that big book around. And it might have color images. They gave me the cheap pre-publication version. I mean, they give it to me for free, so I'm not going to complain. Evolutionary hypotheses. These have to be testable. I'm going to keep circling this. This is important. Good thing I got a scratch-resistant screen. I'm just going to keep going. It's got to be testable. There are a set of other ways to explain how humans are here and how they got here, and those ways are not testable, right? And in your book, it sort of gives you 3 examples. One of those is creationism or intelligent design, right? They fall in that same category, not testable, right? So not in this class. The second one is like seeding theory, right? Okay, this one is again, theoretically testable. This was the idea. You guys know what creationism and intelligent design is, right? We're good there. You guys know what seeding is? So this is the idea that there were like aliens who came in and like just dropped a load of genetic material on the planet, and then here we are. Fine. Could have happened. I don't know. Right? I wasn't here when they dropped off the DNA material, those aliens. But the problem there is that really doesn't answer the question. I mean, once they drop the material, evolution. But what about before that? Like, how did those aliens develop, right? So you're really just moving things back a step. Like, well, I got to figure out what happened now. Did those aliens get seeded from some other... You're just seeding in a circle, right? And that doesn't really get you anywhere. So at some point, you got to stop and go, okay, how did this all start, right? So it's got to be testable, okay? It has to be falsified. Can be falsified. Doesn't have to be falsified. Has to have the capability to be falsified. That's what's important, right? So got to drive that home. So when you come to us with your projects, we may tell you that's interesting, but there's no way to disprove it. When you develop a good hypothesis, you should always think about failure. Okay? You should always think about what set of experiments do I need to do to make this fail? And then do that set of experiments. Don't waste your time on the other ones. You can do those later to figure out details. Do the one that'll fail first, and then you can figure out if your hypothesis was true, right? And, well, not true. Not false, I should say. They're never true, which is a whole separate issue we could have, and we could talk about, you know, the philosophy of scientific hypotheses, but we won't in this class right now. And then I would make everyone read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, right? And they would learn all about, you know, the battle for oxygen and all this fun stuff, right? But that's a whole separate set of things you can find on Amazon, right? They have copies of the book there. That's where I got mine. Actually, I think I gave both of them away. Has to be able to fail. Okay? Has to be able to fail. That's important. Oh, we skipped a slide. All right. Josh did a great job, top down, bottom up. I think for most of us, we're going to be doing, for our purposes, probably bottom up kind of stuff, right? Josh, your bathroom stall sniffle story, that's bottom up. You're like walking around, I'm like, man, I'm seeing weird stuff, you know? I'm seeing weird stuff. Why is that? And then you kind of work from an observation up to a theory. You could come up with a theory, right? If there is a theory out there and you're like, well, if that theory is true, then here's what should come out of that. And you can generate hypotheses that way. I think for your purposes, because I think you're going to have less knowledge about the variety of mid-level theories that are out there, I think it's going to be more likely you come up with a bottom-up approach, because you all are out there observing things, right? Does that make sense? And here's kind of a nice situation. I mean, an evolved psychological mechanism, I mean, it's going to do the same thing as any other adaptation, right? It's going to solve a problem, reproduction or survival. All right, we can skip through a bunch of this. Again, input, output. Josh showed you that great example with the pathogens, right? This is sort of a similar idea. All right, methods, right? How are we going to test evolutionary hypotheses? This is important when you're thinking about your projects, right? Like, how are you actually going to test this? Well, you can compare things across species, right? You can look at different species, see how they solve problems. That works. Cross-cultural methods. Got to be careful with cross-cultural methods, right? There's like the whole downfall of Margaret Mead that never happened but should have. Just throw that out there. Anybody a Margaret Mead fan? Anybody know Margaret Mead? Yeah, they talk about her like she's something, right? I know, right? And I guess, like, I don't know, I hate to take too much away from her because it sounds like I'm being mean. But at the same time, if you're wrong, right? If you notice that a group of folks act in a certain way, and then you can kind of look at another culture and you're like, well, they act the same way, but their cultures are completely different, it's probably an evolutionary mechanism, right? I mean, if the culture's not influencing that outcome, there you go. And that was one of the problems with, little side story, Margaret Mead. She went to Samoa. You guys familiar with Samoa? She was like, oh, look at this awesome island paradise, all free love and no sexual jealousy, right? And then some folks went back later and they're like, oh man, there are actually like higher rates of rape and sexual assault on Samoa than there are other places. Now, this is not current. This is when Margaret Mead was doing her work, so I just want to be clear about that. And so like, I bet what she said wasn't right. But often people who have ideas that align with popular opinion get those ideas moved forward, and they become really interesting and sort of popular, and that's what people hang on to. It's a great book called Galileo's Middle Finger, and it's all about sort of the balance between what's right and what aligns with the popular story, right? And what happens when people generate data that doesn't align with the popular story. And there's some really interesting stories and conflicts in there. It's kind of cool. Brain imaging, genetic methods. You guys are pretty familiar with that. You can look at males and females, right? For our purposes in this class, and things may be different in different classes, we're going to assume males and females in this instance, we're talking about sex, and they're different. And they've sort of evolved in different ways to approach sometimes the same problem from different sides, right? And so, like reproduction, for example, is a great way to think about males and females being different and how they contribute differently to solving problems of reproduction, right? They have slightly different strategies there. If you guys aren't familiar with those, I'm sure there's a YouTube video. Or you could sign up for
Human sexual behavior.
There you go, right? Get a much more nuanced story than I'm going to give you. And then you can look at different folks within the same species. They don't have to be humans. To put the same people in different contexts, right? That's interesting. And then there's some different experimental methods. Where do we get our data? Archaeological records. We dig up stuff. A lot of folks like to use these hunter-gatherer societies, right? Sometimes they call them traditional societies. Okay, you can look at those, kind of see how they solve problems. Sit on a park bench and just watch people do stuff. That's something. Self-reports, you can always ask people. Life history, public records. Again, I think a lot of you folks will tap into public records. You can look at divorce rates. You can look at childbirth rates. You can look at infant mortality. All of these things can tell you important information, you know, and fit your hypothesis. Hey, what are human products? Stuff we make, right? We're talking about tools. Learn a lot about the tools. We're talking about artistic objects, art objects, right, which are different than tools, maybe. All right, there's a nice chart and different types of adaptive problems. These are just sort of big categories to get you thinking about things. We'll talk about sort of each of these as we go along, but I'd like for you to sort of think about that for your projects. Another person, right?